Uh, Good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 20-something CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. As always, our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances with management needs. As a reminder, these webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption. And as a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion, which is facilitated out of the chat. This is all about us, giving us a place to ask the clumsy questions and to practice the bravery and humility necessary for building the future that we want. We always start these webinars with an answer to the question, why this topic at this time by these speakers. In 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement outlined 10 goals with 31 outcomes, and most of them were directed at supporting viable populations of living resources throughout the Bay watershed. Federal, state, and local programs to secure those living resource goals, if you measure them by the policy, attention, and resource commitment, have been primarily directed toward achieving water quality standards in the Bay proper. Why is that? Well, it's because really water quality was the only goal of the 10 that had legal authority under the Clean Water Act. And so the tools for accountability and action were readily available. And I think as an unintended consequence, water quality is thought by many to have literally sucked the oxygen out of the room of achieving our desired impact on living resources. While water quality is a necessary part of the equation, it is not sufficient. Living resource abundance depends heavily on other factors besides dissolved oxygen and water clarity. Some of those include water temperature, salinity, structural habitat, and harvest. In addition, the Bay program is trying to achieve water quality standards in a highly altered system that will continue to change in ways with no historical precedent. So in the midst of all of these issues, many of the outcomes are meant to be realized by 2025, but we've seen various degrees of success to date. And so the question of the day is this, not whether to stop. We certainly don't want to take our foot off the gas of nutrient and sediment load reductions, but how does the restoration community use tools and funding increases to more effectively advance multiple outcomes in order to shift our progress to higher living resource responses? So for our speakers, they're probably familiar to you if you've been on roundtables before. They both come to us from the U.S. Geological Survey, which I think this is so interesting, created by an act of Congress in 1879, and it's evolved over the decades to do much more than map faults and formations. And its mission is now to lead the nation in 21st century integrated research, assessments, and prediction of natural resources and processes to meet society's needs. I say that, I repeat that because both of these speakers have served that mission wholeheartedly, as evidenced by showing up at any forum where they can assist stakeholders in decision making and creating the tools to help them as they navigate. Scott Phillips is the Chesapeake Bay Program Coordinator for the USGS. He served as coordinator for USGS science activities since, when is it? I'd say 1995 since 1995. I'd say before I was born, but that would be a lie. His primary duty is coordinating many of the USGS Chesapeake Bay studies. I think there's about 30 of them at any one moment. And I can personally attest to Scott's ability to see an opportunity for science in service to society around every corner. And there are a lot of corners in the restoration effort. John Wolf is the Assistant Director, Land Change Research, Hydrologic Transport and Response with USGS. And he turns out to be a true geographer, which is all about illuminating context. And this is John's third roundtable, which means that the primarily GIS-based tools that he develops are indeed timely and helpful. And with that, ground rules for the attendees will be placed in the chat box. I'm sure each of Scott and John could each fill an hour by themselves, but we've asked them to limit their remarks to a very short time period, and that is a challenge. And so with that, I will let Scott Phillips have the floor.
Thanks, Denise. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me pull up the presentation and I'll give you a little intro and background. You all able to see that okay?
Looks good, Scott.
All right, good. So, so this is an effort of several people from the USGS. Ken Heyer couldn't be here, but I'll give an overview of the science-based approach we have for these tools. And John's been the real engine behind them of pulling together different data and existing tools to help with decision-making. So appreciate the opportunity to go over this today. We'll cover three things. I'll just talk a little bit about the science approach we have for targeting resources. And when I say resources, that can be natural resources or financial resources. John will go through a demonstration of what we call the targeting portal that he's done a lot of work on. And then we'll finish up with some discussion questions and Q&A for everybody. What we have is really trying to put pieces together so we can make really complex decisions on trying to improve water quality, how we could also get benefits to fish, wildlife, and habitats, as well as ultimate benefits to people and land conservation, all through a lens of climate resiliency. So as Denise went over, we have 10 goals and 31 outcomes in the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, and we tried to put them in these 5 big categories. And as a lot of you know, there's mostly emphasis on water quality, but the purpose behind this science approach is see if we can get some additional benefits as we put in water quality to also for fish habitats. They depend so much on water quality, so that's a natural, as well as recreational benefits to people. Land conservation is another piece we're emphasizing, because besides restoration, if we can conserve lands, we can also provide these benefits. And so we're trying to look at these areas that intersect so you can get multiple benefits and achieve some various outcomes that's in the Bay Program Watershed Agreement. So at the beginning, we're just trying to build from existing tools. John will put together and show you those tools he's gathered to really help inform existing stakeholder programs, and ultimately try to attract some more money for those programs to be carried out. And besides USGS working on this, we really have a relationship with the EPA, the Bay Program Office, the Chesapeake Conservancy, and NOAA helping out on putting all this information together. And we feel the time is right now because we really need to accelerate progress to meet a lot of these 2025 deadlines. We've heard already we're behind on nutrient sediment practices. We're also lagging on almost 11 other outcomes, including wetlands, riparian forest buffers. And we're trying to put more emphasis towards climate resiliency and diversity. Well, thankfully, there's some new funding to try to accelerate progress. Currently there's about $1.2 billion of federal and state funding going towards the Bay Program restoration. But there's additional funding that has come in from the infrastructure law. State and local programs are stepping up with increasing their funding. And then there's a lot of funding from non-governmental organizations and private capital. So given all this, people really have a growing interest in trying to use tools to see where we can focus existing funds and attract new resources. And it's at all levels of government and as well as NGOs that are interested in doing this. And when I say trying to pull things together, it's going to take a big collaborative effort. We are trying to first, if you want to meet multiple outcomes in the Bay program, trying to really expand existing efforts we have. Ideally, that'll attract more funding so you can do this in more places. But you really need to have close collaboration between federal, state, and local governments, as well as NGOs, to try to pull this off. And we'll show you some examples of how to do this. I'll provide one quick example up in for Lancaster County, and then John will show some examples, just what's in the tool itself and how you can pull different management pieces together to answer different questions. And these are just three of the questions we've heard people ask. How can we achieve more Bay program outcomes from the big water quality emphasis? And I'll go into what most effective basins are in a second. But how can you also achieve outcomes trying to bring together different programs? And we have another example we're not going to show today, but how that's been done down in the peninsula of Virginia. And then we're working with the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership on questions they're trying to answer to focus land protection. So let me give an example of the Lancaster County. And what we'll go through is trying to show how you can build and address multiple outcomes. We'll go from water quality to diversity over to local streams in this example, and which tools you can try to use to do that, and then how that can be funded by coordinating more programs and attracting more funds. So that's the goal when we say science-based approach for resources. It's really trying to address more outcomes with existing and new resources. So the example, Lancaster County area is shown here in the red box, and the blue is what's called the most effective basins. So that is where EPA, the Chesapeake Bay program in particular, is targeting funding to try to improve water quality through nutrient reduction practices for nitrogen and phosphorus in these areas. So we'll go into one area to show how you can build from these most effective basins. So this shows a blow up of Lancaster County, and in this case, most of the county is included in these most effective basins. And what's that addressing is two outcomes in the Bay Program Agreement: putting practices in place to meet the Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL. And then once those practices in place, the goal is to improve water quality in its bay itself, or meet standards attainment for dissolved oxygen and water clarity. So the tool that's here is the most effective basins map, and the programs that fund implementing practices in these areas are both the Bay Program grants, and a lot of those are matched through state grants. So let's add on one more outcome. So we can build in informational diversity. And this is a map just showing 6 different criteria for underserved communities. John will go into this a little more, but if you look at Lancaster, the darker areas are where you're benefiting underserved communities more. So you can use a tool like this to lay on top of water quality and start to say, as we're getting these water quality improvements, we're also going to benefit the underserved community, or the diversity outcome of the Bay program, by bringing in this new layer. And then you can attract more funding through different grants that EPA has towards this. So we'll add on another outcome. So now we're taking beyond just diversity and progress to the Bay to talk about local waters. So this is a map from another tool called the Chesapeake Agricultural Priority Watersheds. Areas shown in darker here are where you can get local water quality improvements. That is, there's local impairments in these areas. So if you put in a practice to restore the Bay, those practices will also help in these particular areas to improve local water quality and stream conditions. So now we're addressing 4 outcomes in this one area by bringing in this other map and tool. And we can bring in more programs, especially from NRCS, which is one of the large funders of the Bay program restoration effort, to help build upon what we already have from EPA and the states. Then we'll finish up with the fifth outcome. One of the ways that we're really trying to improve water quality is putting in riparian and forest buffers, but those buffers also improve benefits to streams, temperatures in streams, and to local communities. So these are just tools that exist to try to focus where you want to put buffers in. You can bring in more local programs to implement those trees. And there's more data recently produced, high resolution data. This is 30-meter data. This is the 1-meter data that's been produced by the Bay program under USGS and Chesapeake Conservancy. So you can really focus in on where do you have opportunities to put in riparian and forest buffers, these areas in gray that are missing buffers, that you can help achieve not just the forest buffer outcome, but the 4 other outcomes I've already talked about. So just trying to sum this up, this is just a quick demonstration of how you can address multiple outcomes in one area, and you can use it to coordinate existing funds and attract new resources. To do it, it's going to take local, state, and federal engagement. And this is a model that really can be done any place in the watershed. So John was going to give an overview and a demo of the tool itself, and then we'll come back with just some next steps and start the question and answer. So I'll turn it over to you, John.
All right, thanks, Scott. So I put the URL to the portal, the tools portal in the chat. Hopefully you can see that and you can see my screen at this point. So Scott mentioned one of the purposes behind this was to provide a number of tools or access to information that might help with accelerating conservation and restoration progress with respect to the watershed agreement. And one of the things that we found but through some user research a year and a half ago that dealt with access to tools and data and information was that people had a hard time finding content. And so this was an initial attempt to better integrate just access to tools. There's not a lot here that's new. These are things that have been in existence and used by the work groups and the goal teams of the Bay program really for years now. But we've heard that folks couldn't find these things very well. And so this portal is partly intended to address that. It is a work in progress. And I wanted to point out that the content in here currently really focuses on Chesapeake Bay watershed wide information. So we are very aware that the jurisdictions, the states and local governments often have higher resolution information or tools more specific to their particular needs. So this is kind of like a foundational effort to capture a lot of that information, recognizing that the states and counties in some cases have other tools that they use to target conservation and restoration. So this is the home page. Again, it's gis.chesapeakebay.net/targeting. And the home page basically covers a lot of the information Scott just talked about. Here's this Venn diagram showing the 4 categories of information, and then an overarching representation of climate resiliency because it is a sort of cross-cutting topic. We're right now contemplating breaking out climate in terms of its own content area because of the growth in information and the fact that really it stands by itself in terms of tools that have been used to address sea level rise, flooding, urban heat islands, and so forth. So right now the portal is organized around these 4 tabs, as Scott mentioned: water quality, fish, wildlife, and habitats, land conservation, and increased benefits to people. So I'm just going to go through these 4 tabs and just highlight a few of the components and the organization of this information. So if I'll start with water quality, and the organization of these tabs is similar. There's an overview of what the need is for this type of tool, some overview of some existing applications and things that are already being used, a description of potential opportunities to enhance their use. And then it goes into sort of a decision tree that is intended to help identify particular tools that might address an agency or organization's interests. And then once you get below that, it's just basically an organization or a laundry list, if you will, of basic or various topics that have been organized here. In this case, water quality oriented tools. Starting here, just as an example, the Watershed Non-Tidal Monitoring Network, there are links to both USGS tools and Bay program tools. The USGS pieces right now are undergoing some revisions, so I'm just going to give you an example of one of the Bay program tools. This is the Watershed Data Dashboard that shows the non-tidal monitoring network around the Chesapeake Bay watershed and what some of the long and short-term trends are at these locations in terms of annual loads and flow normalized annual loads. So there's other information in this particular tool, but that's just an example. Many of you have heard of the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool, CAST, which is essentially the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Model, which is a topic in and of itself that really goes beyond what we have time to address here today. But this is basically just a brief description of it, as well as a link to the actual CAST tool. Scott mentioned most effective basins. This is a more recent activity on EPA's part that has evolved over the last 3 years. Basically looking at those areas of the watershed that are likely to have where implementation of practices are likely to have the greatest benefits to dissolved oxygen conditions in this main stem of the bay and the lower Potomac. So these areas in green are areas that have been identified based on relative effectiveness of nitrogen in terms of having the greatest impact on DO conditions in the deep waters of the main stem. So Scott used an example for Lancaster where we're actually combining most effective basins with disadvantaged communities. This is that, that blue layer that's actually showing the number of different disadvantaged communities criteria that exist in any given area of the most effective basins. And he looked at, in particular, at the Lancaster area. And so these darker blue areas, again, were areas where the practices are likely to have benefits to the main stem of the bay, but also benefits to local populations of underrepresented communities. He mentioned the Priority Agricultural Watersheds effort. This is a collaborative effort with EPA and NRCS that's been in existence in some form really since the 2010 Farm Bill. And I'll just give you an example of what the kind of information is in here. So these are 12-digit watersheds around the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And this particular tool gives you the ability to filter the watershed based on criteria. And so if I want to see the watersheds that are ranked in the top 50% for nitrogen loads and the top 50% for phosphorus loads, I can filter that area to come up with subsets of the watershed that meet those criteria. And then Scott also used the example of local impairment. So if I wanted to filter that further, where I'm likely to get a local impairment benefit as well as a bay benefit from both nitrogen and phosphorus, I can subset the universe there. So that's an example of one of the targeting tools specifically oriented towards agriculture. There are other components in the water quality piece that draw from the Watershed Data Dashboard, which is an entity in and of itself with multiple components. There's toxic contaminants information that our toxic contaminants work group use. And again, these are other modules of the Watershed Data Dashboard. So I'll go over to the habitat piece now. In the Bay program, there's a goal implementation team that deals specifically with vital habitats and from a wide variety of tidal and non-tidal perspectives. And so the same organization to this tab, the decision tree to help you identify the tool that might be most effective for your purposes. And then it drops into these sort of outcome specific tools. So there's a forest buffer outcome. Again, this was an example that Scott highlighted in Lancaster. That's actually drawing from a tool called the Watershed Resources Registry. And we're fortunate in the Mid-Atlantic that this collaborative process between EPA and the states, that they've covered most of the Mid-Atlantic, and this forest buffer and wetland restoration targeting tool exists for all the states except New York right now. And this is just an example of what Scott showed for Lancaster, where it's showing the ranking of restoration for riparian restoration based on the number of criteria that have been met. Again, that's a presentation in and of itself, the Watershed Resources Registry, but it's a tool that you can use for riparian restoration targeting. There's a wetland component to that. And then the rest of these, for the most part, the rest of these are specific to habitat parameters of interest to the habitat goal team. And I'll just drop down here to say the Fish Passage, the Nature Conservancy, working with the Fish Passage work group, has prioritized fish blockages throughout the Bay watershed in terms of which ones should be the highest priority for removal over time. And they use this to target fish passage prioritization or fish passage removal, fish blockage removals throughout the watershed. Other things in the habitat include fish habitat, the National Fish Habitat Assessment, stream health that looks at the benthic index of biotic integrity throughout the watershed. Brook trout, there's a number of tools and data layers looking at existing brook trout distribution as well as the threats to that distribution, and black ducks. And I mentioned climate will likely move out to its own category. So the third tab is the land conservation. This is where we have a lot of the content that the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership has developed. They actually have an atlas of conservation opportunities throughout the Bay watershed. So there's a series of models that the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership has used to rank forests, farmland, habitat, and cultural resources for protection or conservation. And I'll just give you an example of the habitat model used by the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership that has been used to identify areas that have the highest priority habitats. And this draws on things like Nature's Network, or you may have heard of Maryland's Green Print program, very similar criteria in terms of where the most important habitat areas. So that's the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership layers. We have the Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds Assessment, which ranks catchments throughout the watershed from the perspective of probably 30 or 40 different metrics. It's a very robust tool that can help identify watershed health and watershed vulnerability throughout the Bay watershed. There's public access content, and I'll just highlight something Scott mentioned, this new high resolution land use land cover information that the Chesapeake Conservancy and USGS and the Bay program collaborated on. There's some different tools available that highlight this phenomenon of land use change. This is actually showing the footprint of change between the 2013 and 2014 year and 2017 and 2018 years. And so you can zoom into areas of interest and actually see what the nature of that change is, whether you're actually getting a gain in cropland or a gain in impervious surfaces or a loss and so forth. So it's very, very interesting and highly detailed tool for the Bay watershed as a whole. So I show this one other, if I can get this off my screen here. One other piece of the land conservation is the output of our Chesapeake Bay land change model that looks at land change into the future under different scenarios. This is an example of what it looks like using vulnerability of the landscape to change, in this case, based on current zoning criteria. So that the zoning will sort of develop in certain areas that combined with the demand for development, it ends up with this kind of portrayal, the future land use change. So the last tab is the increased benefits to people. And this is where you see things like ecosystem services, the environmental literacy work, where the planning unit is not a watershed or a county, but typically is a school district. So it has a different perspective on what we're trying to accomplish from an environmental literacy perspective. We have the environmental justice and equity dashboard that grew out of a collaboration with the diversity work group and has gained a lot of prominence over the last few years. This is the dashboard, sort of an example of the content. I'll just use this environmental tab without getting into it in much detail. but it's showing a variety of different outcomes of the watershed agreement that have been combined with underrepresented populations and diversity metrics. And maybe one more, I think, organizational capacity. This is something that's getting a lot of additional attention these days in terms of where do we actually have the capacity to work with partners around the watershed. And so this was an initial attempt, in this case by EPA Region 3, to collect information where, in terms of where these partner organizations are operating. And what is it? We're working now with Bill Jenkins and Region 3 on the possibility of extending this beyond just points to show the actual area of interest of these organizations. Another aspect of this that's growing is the recognition of organizations that have a diversity interest. And so working with the diversity work group and some C-Stream students over the summer helped us come up with a database, if you will, of organizations with a diversity focus. So that'll be added to this in the near future. So I think I'm going to stop there. That's just a quick tour of a subset of the tools in this portal. We envision the portal is going to continue to evolve. We've been collecting feedback for these types of presentations, and this is an opportunity for you to contribute to that so that we can evolve this further over the coming months so that it addresses more of our user needs. So I think I'll turn it back over to you, Scott.
Okay, let me get to the right slide. And there's another one I actually want to pull up. So John gave you a nice overview, and I'll just finish up real quick on, we've done a lot of interaction from the Bay program, and it's, the organizational structures here. We've been working mostly with the goal implementation teams, because you can, given their topics range from fisheries to engaging people, that's where a lot of the on-the-ground decisions are made, and there's state, local, and federal folks there to try to carry out progress towards these outcomes and working between the outcomes. And we've made presentations to the management board and principal staff, but we thought this would be a good place to reach a wider audience. So that's why we really appreciate the opportunity today. John went over the portal, and we're just trying to promote some of the use of the tools, and longer term action, really trying to enhance these with some of the new high resolution data that John showed you. The big piece is trying to make connections between tools. What John showed you is a listing of individual tools, but trying to increase functionality so you can make decisions between tools of where we want to go and see what kind of support, stakeholder support you would want. So to finish up, if my screen, there we go. We had a couple discussion questions, and we wanted to get your feedback on these, and then we'll have a more general Q&A that Denise will lead. But some of the questions, are the 5 things we listed, those 5 topics, which are most interest to you? How would your organization use this? Some of you already have your own tools, so you might just want to grab a data layer, or all the way through, you might want to have some more direct help on utilizing the tools. That's sort of questions 2 and 3, and then any other improvements. So I think I'm going to stop sharing, and we've got these questions in a poll. Now, Denise, I'll turn it over to you or Lauren of how people can react to the poll.
Yep, the poll has been launched. It should be on participant screens.
So for functionality to get to the poll, Lauren, it's
I think since you're co-host, you won't have access to it, but the participants.
okay, but others do. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's working. I'm not.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody.
I haven't seen anything, Lauren.
But if it's not, we can just go into Q&A Denise, that's fine. This was just a little structured way to get some feedback. Oh, people just say it is up and it is working. Maybe we're just not seeing.
Yeah, again, you're all co-hosts, so you might not be kind of listed as participants.
Yeah, that's fine.
For the poll.
Just
Ah,
FYI,
there we go.
I got a message that says the poll was closed before you submitted your answer. Sorry for barging in.
Jeff, you were just too slow to the draw, I guess. I don't know.
I reopened it, so it should be.
I thought I jumped right on it too.
Well, maybe, is it possible just to leave the poll open, Denise, and people can answer it, at their own leisure, and we can get more in the Q&A now?
Yeah, I think so. And let me just remind people that I'll facilitate the discussion out of the chats, and you already have one. Can the various project layers be streamed into your own projects?
John, I'll let you answer that one.
So there's a wide range of tools here, and some of the data sets are published as services. If you're a GIS person, you could grab the services and pull them into your projects. Some of the data sets that come from the Bay program, from the GIS team, we publish in our open data site, so they can be downloaded and added to your projects. In that case, kind of depends on which tool you're interested in, the way it's set up, and what your specific capabilities are. If you have your own GIS, you're going to have more options, but some of them are accessible just through a web browser.
And John, I'll hop in with a question. Do you need a master's in GIS?
No, you
Utilize
don't.
the tools or what? Okay.
The tools are generally set up to avoid having to need a experience in GIS. Most if not all of the ones I shared are just web-based tools that you just go to a URL, and then, not that they don't require some understanding of how to work them, but they're not super technical in terms of the fundamental GIS behind them. They've generally been packaged in such a way to avoid that kind of knowledge, or that need for that kind of knowledge.
I have a question. I'm sorry, I've got a lot of questions, but while people are entering in the chat, one of them was about, for example, the most effective basins. And so if you're starting with a water quality question and then adding other things onto it, I'm sort of struck by this. There are 5 designated uses, and those most effective basins are targeted at 1, if I understand that correctly, which is the deep channel and deep water. Is there any thought to making most effective basins, for example, for the shallows? Or
wow, is Lee McDonald on this? He's actually expressed an interest in extending it beyond just the deep water, deep channel designated uses of those main stem criteria. I mean, that's what the TMDL is based on, but there's certainly an interest in how you might, what actions you would take for the tributaries and the shallow waters and the tributaries. And there are other tools. I mean, the USGS Sparrow model in and of itself looks more at the loads and yields as opposed to the dissolved oxygen response. So there are tools available to get at that. The most effective basins just happen to be the topic of the interest recently because funding is being steered there, but there are tools to evaluate loads and trends of nutrients and sediment at a more local scale.
we do have a question that it sounds like it might be easy to answer. Our organization is listed under the wrong address in the organizational capacity map you shared. Who should we reach out in order to get this updated?
Well, you can reach out to me. I mean, the data sets that are in there now originated with EPA Region 3, but I know the people involved. So yeah, if there's anywhere you see an error, not only in that data layer, but if you see erroneous information, we want to pull that out or pick that out too.
Okay, Lauren is, and I have another question, and I'm not sure, it's more of a discussion topic, but I've being until recently spending a large part of my professional life up in central Pennsylvania. I used to always ask the question, if we pursued local outcomes, would we get the necessary water quality benefits to the Chesapeake Bay? And I wouldn't have to mention Chesapeake Bay to farmers in central Pennsylvania. Would there be a way for a tool to do that, to show me that if I wanted to simply go after local outcomes, what would be the water quality benefit? So water quality becomes a co-benefit, not the benefit.
Yeah,
Denise, go ahead,
there's that-
John.
I'm just going to highlight one of the story maps that's under the water quality. Let me see if I can share my screen here again. This was a project that I worked on with Emily Trinacosta a few years ago. This is a story map that focuses on how you could take local action that would actually have benefits to local waterways, but ultimately taking that down to the impacts that manifest themselves in the bay. So what you're describing is probably as much a communication strategy as a technical tool, but it is an interesting idea that local benefits ultimately can lead to bay benefits. And so this was a story map intended to sort of get at that. That's a bigger discussion, I think.
Yeah, could you put a link to that story map in the chat, perhaps, John?
I can. It's actually linked from the tool itself under the water quality.
Oh, okay.
The water quality page of the targeting tools portal.
Yeah. And I believe Lauren has the results of the poll.
Okay. Interesting. So these results are the most skewed towards water quality than any group I've seen, except for the water quality gold teams, you can imagine. So, and I think that's why, when we're trying to use the tool of the example, we sort of begin with water quality, is we know that's sort of where most of the emphasis is. And then trying to show what other benefits you can achieve if you're not just focused on, I need to put in a practice to reduce nutrients or sediment to meet my TMDL counting. It's trying to take that wider view of, all right, how can I benefit this local stream by reducing nutrients or sediment? And then how will that benefit the fisheries in the stream? And then the recreational use by people. I mean, so that goes almost back to your question, Denise. I think there's a lot of ways to look at the local lens, and I think it's critical because that's the majority of the people live in the watershed and not necessarily next to the bay. Building from these water quality efforts that have mandates and are pretty well funded to try to make sure we try to have progress towards some of these other topics. And I think if we miss these opportunities over the next 3 years, we'll regret it, that we didn't try to look at the benefits between these topics and not look at them individually.
Scott, you want to take a look at that second one? It's pretty interesting too. So there's quite a few, more than I would have thought, about new places and to identify new places and opportunities.
Yeah, so the second question, yeah, it looked like, about 2/3 of the folks want to try to focus on new places in addition to just trying to better achieve where they're already working multiple benefits. So that's probably a higher percentage, and we've seen with other audiences have been more focused on trying to enhance where they're already working. But given the wide diversity of people here, it's nice to see you have a little different opinion on that. And it looks like based on about a quarter of the people wanting to track expecting new funds, that sort of implies about 3/4 of you just want to try to better focus what you already have as far as programs and funding. And then the third question, this is an important one. This is, sort of gets at Denise's statement. Do you need a GIS degree? And we're hoping not. So, jumping right there to the second one. So a lot of you have tools already. 40% of you have tools, and you would just like some information from this portal. And that's where John's trying to put in some download capabilities so you can grab different data layers you might want. And we are trying for that third question, 2/3 of you want to learn how to better use it. We're trying to put some tutorials together. Some folks here at the Bay program are trying to help with that so that, you can sort of see online some ideas how to better use it. And then, about 1/4 of you, custom analysis, we're trying to have some, GIS people so you can just say, I'd like to be able to look at outcome A, B, and C. What does that look like in my particular place? So this is really helpful to sort of see what your needs are. And that helps us plan for the future. And then the last question, I guess it's a little broader on future ideas. Yes, no.
Nobody's giving you anything to do.
That's fine.
If someone, while you have the experts on the tool, if you'd like to actually take yourself off mute, if you would want to ask them, if you had a particular project in mind and you wanted to know how to use the tool to optimize that, if you'd want to unmute and ask them while you have Scott and John here, please feel free to do that. And because it's like crickets out there, it's very interesting. What's about the future functionality of it, John? I find it really interesting that people don't want you to do anything else, but I would tell you, I'd want to be able to connect a whole lot of the tools together. And I'd also like to run it in sort of a maximization kind of way, right? Like, what could I do? Where would I go if I wanted to maximize multiple outcomes? So if maybe you want to talk about what the future outlook for the tool is.
Well, we certainly have gotten feedback on enhancements to the portal itself, as well as enhancements to specific tools. And some of the tools we've created, some have been created by others. We are interested and are getting ready to conduct some user testing, which will be a deeper dive into sort of what we just shared with you right now. I'm sure that's going to uncover some functionality and interaction areas that can be improved. The other thing that we get, kind of feedback we get, is that there's certain data sets they want to look at that aren't currently there. One that's been sort of a recurring theme is sort of more of a water supply focus, where are the important areas for either groundwater or surface water protection, not a traditional Bay program focus, but still important to a number of the audiences we have. I haven't heard, you're the first one who's mentioned optimization, which is a topic that gets a lot of attention at the Bay program, but optimizing multiple BMPs, for example, where there's a single output that you might be able to quantify. Not saying that's easy, but optimizing multiple outcomes that have different units and different implementation strategies. I'd love to see that. Might not be the rest of this year, but somewhere in the future, optimizing for multiple benefits. And I think there's certainly some discussions going on in the future of CAST world. I think Olivia was on the call. She might have some ideas on that, but that would be the end goal, to be able to optimize multiple benefits and measure them through manipulating different amounts of implementation.
John and Scott, if you want to, I'm going to ask maybe each of you to comment. Do you have an idea of how you'd like to see the portal used? Like, what would you consider its sort of highest possible use?
One One audience has been the federal agencies, since there's a lot of new federal programs and the dollars associated with those programs coming in nationwide. Can we use the portal to show we can have a strategic approach that several of those programs could provide benefits for places in the watershed? So that's one approach. And then conversely, I think people who know their local area and already know the issues that they want to try to restore or protect against could, grab the layers or tools they think most useful and make decisions with them, or grab pieces of these things to enhance tools they already have.
Mhm.
Yeah, one use case that has come up is folks who might be applying for a grant to do some work in a particular area. And so there's not right now a single tool that will give you all of the benefits of whatever practice or project you want to implement. But just having access to the tools from the perspective of multiple outcomes, and then maybe able to justify projects, not just from a water quality perspective, but to look at that same geographic location from the perspective of habitat or benefits to people, or even if there's a land conservation connection. I'd love to see it used in the short term in that kind of context. And then in the longer term, we probably can do a better job at integrating them into one tool as opposed to many tools.
Mhm.
So that's a use case I've heard, particularly with respect to integrating underserved populations and the diversity component with other environmental initiatives. So
Mhm. Yeah, I can imagine it could be very educational, right? I'm thinking if I have a local project that I want to do, but I start looking through those other goals, and I basically learn things about my locality that I never knew, about the fact that it's got some real, areas with high potential for effectiveness for riparian buffers, for example. Eileen Craig has asked a wonderful question in the chat. Are there any plans to do priority stormwater watersheds for developed areas similar to the priority agricultural watersheds target map? And I love this question because there's so many times where people are going, urban is the fastest growing, right? We know we have challenges on the agricultural side, but urban is the fastest growing. And that's a marvelous question. So any plans to do priority stormwater watersheds for developed areas?
So there is, within that watershed resources registry toolkit, in addition to riparian restoration and conservation and upland restoration and conservation and wetland restoration and conservation, there's actually a stormwater component to that prioritizes areas for intervention activities. I don't know, I'm not a stormwater expert, so I'm not exactly sure what the outcome of that would be, but that is the one example I'm aware of. If you Google watershed resources registry, and these are state specific tools, but pick your state of interest, and there for most of them there is a stormwater component. There may be if you wanted to go down the CAST route or other sector specific modeling efforts, there's probably ways to identify, even in Sparrow, the USGS Sparrow model, to identify areas particularly high priorities or highly impacted, largely probably based on urbanization, but there is some geographic distinctions there that you could probably get at.
From John, from your standpoint of really curating and collecting a whole lot of tools, do you perceive that the urban sector could use more attention, that we've developed more tools for the agricultural sector than that urban needs to kind of meet that level? Or do you think that the tools for those sectors are sort of on par with one another?
I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer that. I mean, when you think of Sparrow, for example, there are sectors, different sectors are represented. I'm not sure I could say one is used more or less than another. The priority agricultural watersheds had its origins in basically to help with the Farm Bill. So it had a particular impetus, if you will. We could certainly reach out to the the stormwater, the folks at the Bay program to see what the current state of things is with modeling and targeting. I'm not an expert in that field. Be good to know though for our future.
Yeah. There is a question that came to me, and I'll ask it generally. Is in the tool, is there anything that would offer insights into source water watersheds for drinking water reservoirs?
Well, that was getting back to the drinking water component. That's a request we've specifically received from NRCS, a couple of different offices of NRCS, as well as others. I mean, it's on the, I don't know how to describe it, somewhat on the fringe of the watershed agreement goals and outcomes. Not saying it should be there, but it's not a specific water quality component. But we're seeing that request more and more. I think Scott's heard that as well. And there's a good bit of work in the USGS world that we could probably leverage to better integrate that.
We tried to put some initial information together actually for the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, because they wanted to, from a protection standpoint, where those source water for surface water or groundwater, we should try to focus on for land protection.
So we just have a couple minutes left, so I'd like to ask each of you, John and Scott, give you an opportunity to either what's sort of the one thing that you would like people to sort of keep in mind about utilizing the tool or accessing the tool right now, and then if what's the next thing you would like to add. So maybe I'll ask Scott, since we haven't tugged on you for a couple minutes. Do you want to answer first?
Yeah, I think in the short term, just people having the wider views of working with the water quality focused agencies to bring in their priorities of trying to protect habitat or benefits to people as soon as possible. And so that the water quality decision makers can try to have that wider view. Right now it's pretty focused on just what they need to do to improve the bay or in some cases local streams. So and a lot of those practices are trying to accelerate over the next 3 years. I think we have a window for people on the phone and on the call like this to try to make their voices heard to especially their respective states and local governments. Let's take advantage of the water quality restoration to get some other benefits to our community.
Great.
Yeah, my observations would be similar. There's a lot of talk about cross-outcome collaboration and opportunities to achieve multiple benefits. And so one of our goals here is to bring information to the forefront to help with that. Obviously, right now, there's still separate tools, but the idea of getting away from the stovepipes, I like to think of, I know this is kind of corny in terms of the watershed agreement, but geography is kind of like the common currency of all these different initiatives, and being able to see where everybody's working in a particular location from multiple perspectives, I think is helpful, even from an informational perspective, to help with that multi-outcome approach.
John, I'm going to use that saying, geography is the common currency. I love that. I think it's really true. And to close out, I'm going to read you a comment from Fred Dobbs at ODU. Gentlemen, yours has been a superb presentation. It makes me want to drop everything and become fluent with the tools. I can't do that, unfortunately, but I will be certain to alert our students at ODU about this resource for information and decision-making. Thank you. And I think that reflects my comments perfectly. So thank you, Scott and John. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the webinar. And join us again next month for the next CRC Roundtable. Have a great day.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.